vitamin D, unless you've been hiding out in a cave or on a deserted island, is something we've all been hearing about. It is my favorite subject, just about, and it does come with a degree of controversy. The controversy came to a head this November when the Institute of Medicine, which was mandated by the National Academy of Science to be an advisor to the nation on health issues and scientific issues in medicine, came up with its 2010 report on vitamin D. Back in 1997, with its last report, it came out saying that they didn't think there was much beyond bone health that vitamin D did, and the vitamin D research community basically was in an uproar because of that. So they spent about a decade trying to get the committee to look again at the vitamin D evidence. And they did spend 2 years doing that, and they came again with a statement that while vitamin D clearly has a strong impact and there's good evidence for that impact on bone health, there is inadequate evidence to support its benefits for other health issues such as cancer prevention, prevention of heart disease, autoimmune disease, high blood pressure, and I could go on forever. There are over 4 dozen diseases linked to vitamin D, so we'll get into just one of them tonight. And what I did was chose cancer as our subject for tonight. Let's go back a few steps to the beginning of the previous century. In 1900, rickets as a disease of children was very, very common. In rickets, there's not enough calcium or mineral getting into the bones, so as children grow, their bones sort of are like rubber, and they become bent, bow-legged, they get distorted pelvises and backbones, and it's really a nasty, nasty disease. And in 1900, 80% of children in Boston suffered from rickets. And it was not because of poverty, it wasn't because of poor nutrition, it was simply because there was so much soot in the air from burning coal and wood for heat and manufacturing in cities, that for the first 8 or 10 stories of the ambient air was just like thick, like an English fog, which they have a similar problem in London. And so ultraviolet light from the sun would bounce off of this soot and never get to the kids in the streets, so that the ultraviolet light couldn't get to the skin and produce vitamin D. It was ultimately found that if these kids were put onto the rooftops of hospitals in downtown Boston or New York in warm weather, when there was plenty of sunshine with ultraviolet in it, they actually got better. And so ultimately they discovered that it was the production of vitamin D in the skin that was impacting the rickets disease. And very shortly after that, in the mid-20s, they discovered vitamin D as an actual compound and started adding it to milk. Milk was a natural compound to put vitamin D into, because if a child could get 2 glasses of milk, that would provide 200 units of vitamin D according to how they were supplementing it, plus calcium. So pretty much rickets disappeared within a matter of less than a decade. And it was forgotten about, except the impact was that everyone thought this was a wonderful miracle vitamin. It cured this horrible disease. It probably had something to do with the cures of TB back in the 1800s, when people went to sanitaria up in the mountains and got lots of fresh air and sunshine. So there was this whole idea that vitamin D maybe cures everything. So they started putting vitamin D into hot dogs, beer, soda pop, just about everything. And then during the war years, there wasn't much oversight on what was happening. In the medical field, vitamin D was being used in massive doses. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units a day were given to people to cure various bone problems. And they were not monitored well because there was no test at the time for blood levels of vitamin D. And ultimately, in the 1950s, there were a number of cases, both in adults and in children, where there were fatal overdoses because of this sort of lack of regulation. So after a number of articles appeared, and not too many appeared, but they were startling enough, that the treatment with these very high doses was cut out. Vitamin D was removed from all foods except for milk. and now it's also in cereals, but it was limited to very small amounts. And it was really decided that people should be taking very limited amounts. And the idea of 200 units as what is needed to prevent rickets basically became the standard of what we need for vitamin D, and that's what we're living with up until this November. This November, the Institute of Medicine's committee decided that 600 would be appropriate. That's still about a seventh of what most people probably need, but that's another story. So the paradigm was well set in the 20s for vitamin D being well understood as related to bringing mineral calcium into the bone and making bones strong and supportive. And then in 1980, everything changed. Two brothers by the name of Garland were working together on an interesting project. They worked with 49 states and the U.S. Weather Forecast Bureau, the U.S. Weather Bureau, and they found out how much ultraviolet light was hitting, on average, each one of those states. And then they got the mortality rates, or death rates, for colon cancer from those 49 states. And they ranked them, and what they saw was that as sunshine got higher, the cancer rates, death rates went down. In states where there was not much sunshine, like Washington, the cancer rate, death rates were much higher, and those states that were kind of intermediate had intermediate levels. So they made a leap of faith and said, we bet this is vitamin D related. That sunshine, vitamin D makes sense. And they postulated that vitamin D had an impact on cancer rates. That was Garland's first contribution. A whole lot has happened since that time. It's one thing to say that there's an association between levels of vitamin D and cancer rates. It's another thing completely to say that that level of vitamin D is causing a lower cancer rate. So what we really have to do is 3 levels of investigation or proof. The first one is to look at various population studies, and Garland was the first one to publish a big population study.